Well, good morning, and we are live. I am back again, Chris Stewart. Good morning, everybody. Happy New Year. It's nice to look out the window and see new things, see the snow kind of calming down, see things changing in Georgia. As you can see, I have my vote hat on today because I want people in Georgia to do their thing so that we can have a completely new government and a fresh start this year. My guest today is Colin Seal. Colin, welcome. Good morning.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Listen, man, the reason that I wanted to have you is because I stopped doing the previous broadcasts that I was doing. And I had a time of reflection over the last month in December to really think through the advocacy that we do in education. Are we getting anywhere? Really, the question for me is like, what's changing? You know, we're years in, hundreds of millions of dollars into advocacy and building new schools. In the sense that, are we making any gains? Like the question of, are we making any gains? Is anything changing for children is bothering me. And one of the things that's bothering me the most has been something that has stayed with me for the longest time, which is just of all the gaps that I've talked about in my life, and people have heard me before break down the 5 gaps that make up the achievement gap, which are the belief gap, the time gap, the preparation gap, the leadership gap, and the teaching gap. And out of those 5 gaps that make up the achievement gap, the teaching gap, the leadership gap, those have more to do with the schools and the systems. But in terms of us as parents, we control the belief gap, the time gap, and the preparation gap. Those are all things that can be handled in the home. And of those 3, the most deadly to me seems to be the belief gap. If you just don't believe that kids can achieve, then that's going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you're not by yourself in believing they can achieve, meaning you have friends and neighbors and communities in an entire country who believe a group of kids can achieve, now it's over. The game's over. So you came to mind when I was putting this together, and I was like thinking, how can we start talking about the good news? We've studied failure. We've studied the fact that let's say, only 30% of kids are achieving. We'll concentrate on the 70%, but we won't concentrate on that 30 and say, well, wait a second now. So you popped in my head because humble beginnings, grew up in Brooklyn. I'm sure that there were people around you who haven't made it as far as you have made it. You became a teacher. You became an attorney. You led a statewide organization. You're an author. You've written a book. You run a firm. And I'm sure that there was a kid sitting right next to you on the street one day in your neighborhood who didn't make it as far as you did. So can you help me unpack the system, the belief system that you had in you and that you had in adults around you that helped you? I hate to use the words, but I can't think of a better way of saying beat the odds, right?
So I think this line of questioning is really exciting because you're right, Chris. We don't talk about this side a whole lot. I do want to share one like revelation because when you sort of live with these concepts, you do sort of grow with it and you come to these aha moments. And last year, as we've been just doing this work across the country to really talk about like critical thinking and really kind of raising the bar for rigor in the way that we look at our classrooms, in all of our classrooms, to populations that don't typically get access to this kind of quality of learning, this character of learning that just awakens their soul, so to speak, that really sort of drives them. It's like these concepts of, well, maybe school should be more than remediate, intervention, but I should be able to be pushed, even if, you think that I'm supposedly too low or too slow to handle even grade level work, much less the kind of work that really lights me on fire. But I've come to understand, Chris, that the belief gap, as we hear it from the mouths of folks in education, is different than I actually thought. I used to think that when people were saying like these kids can't, it was the most insidious form of explicit bias. Forget implicit, like explicit bias when you're saying that these kids can't because of X, Y, and Z. You know, I think the last time we were on here, you talked about like all the P's, you know, the poverty, the politics, the parents, like all the reasons why these kids can't. But as I started to probe and really start to understand the conditions that get folks in education who say they're about that life, who are, you know, woke as they ever can be and really sort of bought into these constructs, why do they still kind of feel these things about these kids can't? Well, it turns out very often it's not that these kids can't. It's not that they believe that these kids can't. It's that they don't really understand the practical way to create the conditions such that those kids can.
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm.
that's kind of like my first sort of like way of thinking about this. And when I look at my own story, I think you're right about like, you know, parents being able to do a little something about that preparation gap and being able to be really a strong advocate. But I can honestly say that at a certain point, you know, kids stop listening to their parents. You know, you become a teenager. And when I was 13 years old, I swear to you, I knew everything there was to know under the sun. You couldn't tell me anything. So here I am at this place where, like, according to the way we look at school systems, particularly in New York City, I was one of the kids who made it. You know, in the year 1996, 1997, you know, there were not a lot of Black and brown kids being accepted to specialized high schools in New York City. I got accepted to Bronx High School of Science. There are even fewer Black and brown kids at my high school than there were in the late 90s when I went there. But with all that being said, I went to Bronx Science as a kid who was double accelerated in math, accelerated in English, accelerated in French, and I struggled. I failed multiple classes. I had like 80 absences my freshman year. And when I started...
So can I ask you about that real quick? Yeah. Why were you accelerated?
It's a good question. I was accelerated because of an interesting story around like laziness. So like I was just going all the way back. I'm born in November, and my mom was like, this kid is getting the hell out the house. So she made me like take a test to kind of get into school early beyond the cutoff date. So by the time I started kindergarten, they were well aware of my IQ scores. Okay. And for whatever reason, I was in New Jersey for kindergarten. And then I'm in Crown Heights now, PS 91 in first grade. And I'm getting in trouble all the time. I'm like really, really the teacher's worst nightmare, because they would try to punish me with like, oh, okay, well, here's an extra worksheet for homework. And I'm like, oh, who cares? I'll do it in 2 minutes. And it was this huge sort of vibe where I felt like a bad kid. And I was really impulsive and all sorts of things and very distracted. And I ended up getting tested. I had a speech impediment. I had all these behavior challenges, but the test revealed that I should have been in gifted and talented courses from the time that I was in kindergarten. So now I'm being bused to a different school. I'm being bused to a school that has this gifted program, like a school within a school, self-contained class. And by the time I'm in that same there's so few kids that are identified. There are only 12 kids per grade level that like they had a bridge class, and I was at the bottom of the bridge. So it was 2nd/3rd grade, 3rd/4th, 4th/5th. And at a certain point, the teacher, I don't want to say the teacher was like lazy, but the teacher's like, you know what? I'm not going to keep on doing all these multiple preps. I'm just going to teach one thing. So they had to be one grade ahead, you know, as part of this program. So I basically was always taught in a way that put us 2 grades ahead. And, you know, and when I got to middle school, I went to a middle school where we were part of a self-contained group that kind of traveled around the school together. And I had a math teacher, Miss Williams, Black woman, super strong, super fierce. Another math teacher who wasn't even my teacher, Mr. Joseph. And by the time I'm in that same there's so few kids that are identified. I'm not gonna
getting feedback.
Okay, that got me. It went away. Okay, so now when I'm like Miss Joseph and Miss Williams, they recognized that my group was a different kind of group. They saw how ahead we were. We were on a math team. We were like winning these competitions all the time. So they're like, can we try to give these kids the equivalent of Algebra 1 in seventh grade? It's never been done. But they were like, let's give it a shot. Let's give it a shot and see what happens. And I remember in seventh grade, we were taking Algebra 1 and we had a math team competition. And at that time, a lot of the math concepts were like based off of algebra. And they saw how we were scoring. They had to change the questions. They had to change the kinds of questions that they were asking because we already knew all that algebra and we were able to like, really dominate these contests. And it's like, there's not a whole lot of like all black teams coming into these math team competitions that are doing this. So there's a part of this whole process that a scholar, Donna Ford, who's a really brilliant gifted education scholar, and Gilman Whiten, who's another amazing gifted education scholar, we talk about it as like the scholar identity model. When you grow up with a really positive sense of scholar identity, there were things that when I got older, I didn't know what people were talking about. Like, what is acting white? I don't even know what that even means. Like, I didn't go to school with any white kids, so I didn't know what that meant. But I had a really positive sense of self because I was like, this is what we do. We are
So
scholars.
you didn't get the, even though you went to a specialized high school, you weren't trained to believe in the acting white thing.
I mean, it really didn't make sense, honestly. It just really didn't make sense because, you're sitting there with kids that are stupid smart, right? They're so smart it's stupid, right? So like, and a lot of us grew up, whether it was Soundview in the Bronx or Jamaica, Queens, or where I was from South Brooklyn, we were kind of used to being like, in isolation in some of our schools, because there was a certain point where like I wouldn't even say it was acting white at a certain point, but there was definitely a smart to be cool, cool to be smart dichotomy of like, okay, well, like certainly there's a reason that the kid in eighth grade, who was the boy that was voted most likely to succeed, didn't graduate from high school. He didn't graduate from high school because he was cool, and for him, it didn't seem worth the effort. It didn't seem like, once he got to high school, he felt like he was just a number. And to be honest with you, his struggle was a lot like my struggle and a lot like a lot of our other friends' struggles as well. Of like, somehow it wasn't like an acting white thing. It was that we didn't have the same sense of scholar identity when we went into these big box systems. We were like loved and nurtured and supported and pushed and beat down. Like they weren't. If I didn't do homework, I never forget this lady, Miss Sklar. She got on my nerves, man. Got on my nerves. We had to do this like Women's History Month calendar, and I had this thing in my mind from a young age. I'm like, I ain't doing it. I'm not doing it. I don't really have a whole big reason. I just don't feel like doing a calendar. I just think it's like a waste of time. I don't feel like doing it. Or we had to do this one thing. We had to make these 3D shapes and create like figures out of it. I'm like, I hate glue. I hate arts and crafts. I'm not doing it. I know what she was trying to do with growing our spatial sense and all this stuff. I wasn't doing it. And like, she never let us off the hook. She always called my mother and like, Colin didn't do this. I'm like, man, you stay snitching. I don't want to do all this work. But she really didn't allow us to like just get lazy or not deliver. Like they held us accountable for these things. When I went to
is that the proverbial high standards? Is that the proverbial holding kids to high standards thing we hear about?
So I'd like to talk about high standards a little bit differently. I like to talk about it in terms of like, we are not going to leave your genius on the table. We are not going to allow you to like not get your like potential flourish to the fullest extent that it can be flourished. And when I started like thinking about that, like everything changed in high school. Because when I went to high school, I was just a lazy black boy. If I wasn't doing homework, it would never occur to somebody that this made sense. Like that, or this didn't make sense. Here I am, right? I'm a first year kid in a classroom with mostly juniors, right? And remember how high school goes? Like I was 4'11" when I started high school. I'm in class with grown men and women with beards and mustaches and purses or whatever. Yeah. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, huh. And I'm not doing any work. And nobody intervenes. Nobody says, Maybe he's having a hard time adjusting because he's so much younger than his other classmates here, and we need to, like, whatever have you. All the stuff they talk about SEL today, like, I just was a kid that was struggling and nobody really intervened. Nobody called my mom when I was like skipping French every single day and failed French. When I decided I was accelerated in French. And I didn't even go to summer school. That was my extent of not caring. I'm like, I can go to summer school, or I can say I'm already accelerated, so who cares? So I chose who cares. And again, nobody spoke up. Nobody came in and tried to counsel me and whatever. Nothing. And this was at like a specialized high school.
So then in that case, it requires you to have the internal motivation to turn that around, since no one is watching.
I can tell you what happened. Okay. So, because I don't know that it was internal motivation, because the truth is, you start to believe these narratives after a while. Like, well, maybe I don't really belong here. Maybe I'm like, good for the hood, but I'm not good in these like bigger spaces and whatever have you. And what actually happened was sophomore year, there was this woman, Miss Simon, a counselor, who she finally got involved. She was an adult that was like, you know what? This doesn't make sense. We got this kid who comes in with such impressive, skill set and prerequisites, whatever. He should be a rock star here. And she pulled me into her office and she kind of showed me where my grades were, what I came in with in middle school, and try to dig into this idea of why are you not going to class? And there was a lot going on. Don't get me wrong, there was a lot going on. When I started high school, my mom started going to college, so she wasn't around as much because she was trying to further her education at the same time. So she didn't get home till 10 o'clock at night most nights. I had to travel an hour and a half each way to get to high school, which is a whole nother thing of how does this even make sense? How am I even on a train for 90 minutes each way to try to get a high quality education, because my local high school is a dropout factory? It shouldn't be that serious. I should be able to just walk down the street and go to a school and have that school, be where I needed to be. It worked more or less for elementary and for middle school. But then
we'll seize on that for a minute, though. Yeah. Let's just seize on that for a minute, because one of the typical reform theorems is that choice matters. You getting on that train and you spending an hour and a half to get somewhere else. Yeah, that's a long train ride. Matter of fact, I mean, Colin, that's among one of the longest ones that I've heard of people, even with these METCO programs in Boston and other places where you have these programs where you could go out of the city, get out of the hood and go to another school. Does that make a difference in your story? In your story, if we're thinking, okay, you just told me you have a dropout factory closest to home. If you're the same kid, same level of motivation, you're equally as bright as you were back then, but you don't get on the train and you don't go an hour and a half to that high school. You go to the local high school. Do you still excel in that dropout factory?
So I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. And
what's your guess? What would be your guess?
My guess is that there were ways that, as a human being, as a young person, that commute grew me. Okay, it expanded my sense of possibility, to kind of speak in cliche terms. I was in Brooklyn, South Brooklyn. If I didn't go to this high school, I wouldn't have friends in Harlem, the Bronx, and Queens. I just wouldn't have, even in my own city, I would have been in relative isolation in my own city, because I never really would have explored and understood and seen where so many people are coming from, to see this sort of magic that creates the essence of New York. I never really would have done it. Now, I think it probably would have been a similar sort of feeling to my middle school, where there would be a school within a school sort of thing, where maybe I would get access to a certain type of coursework or whatever have you, and be with this certain group, and it could be fine from that respect. But I don't. The other thing I gotta name is that I lost some of myself in high school. I lost some of myself in high school, and it only started getting that back when I got really involved. There was an organization called Boss/WIS. So the interesting part about Bronx Science is, you know, Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, is a graduate from Bronx Science. And when I was a 10th grader, 11th grader, we actually renamed our auditorium like the Kwame Ture auditorium, which was pretty radical for the time to do at Bronx Science. And like, they had this organization called Boss/WIS, like the Black Organization for Student Strength / West Indian Society, because, Caribbean folks, there weren't a whole lot of us, and a lot of our issues were, very similar to, Black students. So we were all Black. We were all there. We were all kind of gung-ho. Getting involved in that, affirming my identity there was a really big part of that. I wouldn't have had to be a part of an organization called the Black Organization for Student Strength at my high school down the street, because I didn't really, this sounds weird, man, but I didn't really know what my Blackness meant. I didn't really understand that, like, this whole idea of being Black and brilliant at the same time was funky to some people, that rubbed some people the wrong way. Or, like, I don't know. I never had questions about whether that was normal until I went to this high school, and I felt like, oh, I guess to be brilliant, I gotta be really nerdy. I've gotta be Asian. I gotta have, like, a lot of, like, the fanciest TI 89. I can't have a TI 83. TI 83 is for, like, the schmucks. I need to have like an 89 and just be all extra with it. And I was like, no.
Is that we got to try twice as hard. We got to be twice as good.
I don't even know mentality. What that is. Well, I don't think it's even that. I think it's that, like, I can't be me and be successful at the same time. That's a narrative that, like, was sort of presented to me in high school. It was something that I maybe adapted in college. So, like, there's a program called En-ROADS, for instance. Okay, En-ROADS is a program for, first generation college students, Black and brown kids who are getting into corporate America, and they're trying to groom you for corporate jobs. And I remember sitting in this workshop, and they're like, all right, so, like, those braids, no braids. Facial hair, get rid of that facial hair. That suit, that tie, whoa, way too bright, or whatever have you. Here's what you got to do. I'm like, the hell's wrong with you people? I'm not doing all this. And I remember feeling like, you're asking me, you're coaching me to leave me at the door so I can have an opportunity to do this. I was like, this seems bizarre. It seemed weird. And I remember, like, when I had an interview with some company, the whole time I sat down like this to resist. Of course, I didn't get the internship because I looked like a fool. I looked like someone who wasn't going to show effort and energy. But, like, I also struggled with this idea that, like, why do I have to be like that, like them, to be successful? I just don't get it. Like, I honestly just don't get, why do I have to do that to be successful when that game is not meant for me? That system was not built for me. So why would we go through the motions to do it like the normal way that everyone else does, instead of, like, tapping into the magic that can allow us to do this very differently? Because maybe we don't need to, like, learn how to play the game and navigate the system. Maybe we need to learn how to slay the game and dismantle the system. And that's a very different character.
You probably have lots of very bright, very smart young people who have that exact same attitude when it doesn't have anything to do with their proficiency or what they can learn or what they know. They're smart, they're bright. But when it comes to the teaching things like you got a code switch, there's a serious resistance to that, a rightful, kind of resistance to wanting to do that part, especially if you're bright and you're talented. You're like, man, why I got to do all that? Why I got to cut my braids? Right. For instance, just to have a job here when I can do everything else, though. Like, I'm smart. I got this or whatnot. How much of that do you think is a real barrier or an imagined barrier that we have about specifically urban young people, smart urban young people, that it's not just about the proficiency and whether you can do well on tests and all that, because maybe you can, and you're still going to have some of the cultural artifacts of the hood that you're not willing to want to, I don't know what to call it, whitewash,
So I think about this when I look at, like, you can just take a journey through the in-school suspensions, the kids who are your frequent flyers and behavior referrals, and you could ask your kids this honest question and be like, "Hey, you know what? Ask any teacher, how many brilliant kids do you have that are getting in trouble almost every single day?" And they'll most likely say the bulk of them. The bulk of them. And it's like, what's going on? What's going on? And I think about this. I think about this idea that, like, we've got a profession. We got a profession where most people who enter it become educators because the system worked for them. It's a very compliance driven thing. That's the reason why teachers get like better rates on car insurance. More or less, we're going to follow the rules. And you got kids that are coming in and they've got a sense of savviness, a sense of cleverness where I can tell you, like, just last week I was watching a video of a classroom in Paterson, New Jersey, where the teacher was using one of our structures to have this whole conversation around, like, should Alexander the Great even be considered great? Okay. And they were going through this discussion and they were doing it from different perspectives, from the perspective of its generals, from people who, like, whose land he took over, from the peasants. And one of the guys, kids was like, the peasants will say he's great. Because if they don't say he's great, they're just going to get executed. Because that's how Alexander the Great used to roll. But, like, that's not the answer that they were really looking for. So here we are in this dichotomy where we would say, like, big picture, we praise, like, leaders who march to the beat of their own drummer and go against the grain. We almost worship these tech titans who we call disruptors. But we are kicking these kids out of class every day because the way they approach the world is disruptive to our sense of comfort, to our sense of, like, what seems to be expected. They got a smart mouth. But isn't that the point? Isn't that the point? So why is it that, like, the same
kind of better than having a dumb mouth, isn't it?
Right? Like, so I'm just like, okay, like, just because you get your feelings hurt, because this kid is actually, like, more on their toes than you might be. Like, why do you have to, like, let that become the thing that, like, makes you feel like, you know what, get out? So,
I feel like we have the wrong people teaching our kids. And I feel like that's a hard thing to say. Almost nobody's going to join me on something to say something so bold. But I just, honestly, you just said something that rung very true with me. Many people who go into teaching are people who are very compliant within the schools, which is why we have so many white females teaching. And when I say that, it's not to, like, it's not to attack them as a people. It's just to say that school systems, in my mind, from what I've read in history, were actually, the behavioral code of schools was basically with the white girl in mind. So even white boys, if they want to succeed in school, have to adopt white girl behavioral standards to actually do well. That's even for white boys, right? So because that's the model public education student. So they do well. They really enjoy school. They excel at the middle class behavioral expectations, which gets them better grades, even better grades than they deserve, actually, because if you are compliant, you behave well, and you're not a problem, your grade inflates in the minds of teachers who are a lot like you. So if that works for white boys, imagine now you have Puerto Rican boys and Black boys and others who are expected to live up to that same that same model of behavior. So when you step outside of that, you're a problem. And the people who consider you a problem, you just mentioned, like, well, he's got a smart mouth, so he's got to go out. Or we see studies. I always like to go back to saying that I'm grounding when I'm saying some of these things are in research. In research, we are told that Black boys, for instance, appear older than they actually are, which makes it easier to punish them, right? If you look at a middle school Black boy and he looks like he's 17 to you, it's easier to not treat him his actual age. So anyways, looping all the way back around, that puts us in a really tough position because my assessment is then we have the wrong people teaching our kids. I think what you would probably tell me, and maybe jump in here and say this, is you believe in constructs, you believe in critical thinking, you believe in models, you believe in ways of like being able to, for a teacher to be able to work with students that gets away from everything I just said, right? Like, how do you teach critical thinking if you're a white female teacher and you have a classroom full of black kids? Well, I'm sure you have the answer to that.
So,
right.
So let me kind of tell it from the story of like being a parent right now with a kid in kindergarten, a kid in third grade, and just listening to what's happening. So like my son, Oliver, he's in class. This is maybe the first, second month of school, and they're going through the letters and they get to I. Okay. And what's a word that starts with I? And some kid comes out and says iguana. Okay, great. What's another I word? And I'm like, man, I'm glad this is not a drinking game because I can't even think about an I word on the top of my head. And then Oliver looks at the screen for a little bit. He unmutes and he's like, lizard. And the teacher's like, no, that's not right. And goes on to somebody else. And I'm sitting there like, oh, God. Seriously? You're just going to leave that like that? Like, we don't even have any comfort with like how to grapple with these kinds of mistakes. Like, what kind of mistake is that? That's a brilliant mistake. Let me break down the levels of the brilliance there, okay? It could be possible that like he's just making a straight up association of like, okay, that's an iguana. A lizard is like an iguana. I'm making that connection. That's one possibility. 2, you said I words. Like lizard has an I in it as the second letter. So we're not necessarily knowing that this is an I word, meaning that you start with the I versus having an I in it. 3, and this is the killer part. Oliver is in kindergarten. He's doing all digital. So for him, if you go on Zoom right now and you type a capital I and a lowercase L, you cannot tell the difference because it's the same exact character. So in his mind, he's actually looking at iguana and lizard as starting with the same exact letter, and you're missing it.
Okay, let me stop you there then, because this is a great example for me. You're providing me a model for thinking about this. In that, if you are victim to the belief gap, you will not make all the assumptions you just said. So if you already believe that there's no intelligence in the boy, then what you just said, you just made some brilliant connections about what maybe is going on with his cognition, right? But if you didn't believe in him enough to actually believe that there was cognition happening, you would just move on, right?
So here's my issue, though. White kids ain't doing that great either. So like this is not something that's specific to black children, to brown children, to poor children. Like this is across the board. Most teachers can't stand mistakes. They can't tolerate them. Right is right, period. And they don't have the nuance. They don't understand the funk that's involved in this process. They don't. They don't. So like that's this whole different issue. And then fast forward to my daughter who skipped over first grade and now she's here in third grade and she's doing shenanigans one week. She's like on YouTube while the teacher is talking and we see, I was like, listen, man, like I talk to you all the time about integrity and what's integrity? Integrity is doing the right thing when no one is looking. I'm like, all right, so like we're going to expand on that. You're going to write like a little essay kind of talking about integrity. And she's like, I don't really want to do that. I'm like, what you mean I can do it? Well, I just don't think that like that's even right. I'm like, what do you mean that's not even right? She's like, well, like you talk about integrity, doing the right thing when no one's looking. I'm like, yeah. So you're trying to say Harriet Tubman doesn't have integrity? I was like, huh? Well, Harriet Tubman is technically stealing people's property. I'm like, man, get out of here, man.
She got you. She got you.
She got me. But all I can think is like, she would get kicked out of class. Because very few teachers can actually sit there and take a slice of humble pie from Black Girl Magic and be like,
That was very much my story, too. Just to be very honest with you, you're hitting on my sore spot because that was me. And actually, I want to say that I got in trouble every year of school, at least after sixth grade. After sixth grade, I probably got in trouble. And it was not trouble. It was what you just said. It was that Harriet example. It was the having teachers say things that seemed like sweeping generalizations and being a young person who wanted to test it and call it out. And eventually it called my black ass out the classroom on a pretty regular basis and had good principals in some cases who were like, why don't you just sit in my office today? And we're going to talk, let's talk, and here's a book or something like that. But I didn't get the classroom instruction.
And to some extent, like, I understand it. I understand the sense of overwhelm that teachers can feel sometimes, and the prescriptive model of like, everything needs to be just so. A lot of that comes from this idea that if I don't have that, it's going to be pure chaos and I can't deal with it. And what I try to introduce to teachers is that, like, when kids are doing more heavy lifting, your job actually becomes easier. You become the person who monitors student learning versus the person that's so exhausted because you just spent all that time covering all that content as if that was your job. Your job has never been about covering content. It's about ensuring that students learn, which has got to be both, right? It's the instructional delivery, but a lot of it is a checking for understanding and the nitty-gritty formative assessment, which is like, how do you know that kids know? And
do you think those things are at cross purposes, like having to cover content, having to assess, having to pace yourself through a scripted curriculum so that you're in the same spot as the teacher next door at the same time in the year? And also, here comes Colin Seal with this critical thinking program or project or curriculum. How can I have the time to be expansive, to allow kids some breathing room? Let's do some Socratic method today, or let's do something else. Oh, no. I'm sorry. I got to stay scripted. I got to pace myself with the other teachers, and we have to assess and all that. Are we at cross purposes the way that we expect teachers to balance all that?
I'm going to be honest. Teaching is an interesting profession. The percentage of like teachers who are monitored to that level of detail that they're on this page at this time on this day is actually very small. It's very small. So like at the end of the day, teachers have a lot more autonomy than we talk about. One of the workshops that we lead off our partnerships with is talking about power. I cannot stand the phrase just the teacher. You have the power to crush souls. Or to unleash magic, right? Like, don't tell me you don't have power. You've got a ton of power. You make hundreds of decisions every day with no one checking in on you making those decisions. So when I start talking about what this looks like, if you want to talk about making equity real at the classroom level, it means that, like, in a real sort of fundamental shift, we've got to stop talking about all kids. So many districts and school systems have these visions around what all kids and all students are going to do. And I'm like, I have a problem with all, because sometimes all creates kind of this mythical average child. Like, it erases individuality of who kids are. So I'm like, what if we talked about each and we shifted from all to each? And we start talking about each, we're talking about an ideal, right? I know at the end of the day, it's like humanly impossible to differentiate every single thing you're doing for every single child. But if what we were trying to do is say, all right, what do I need to do to ensure that every kid is actually learning? Each child is learning and actually being able to thrive and have a chance to exceed, like, hit a standard of excellence. It's a whole different thing. It's like by any means necessary at that point. Now I have to be open to different ways that kids articulate and stuff, because I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm going to rock with that. That's not exactly how I would have solved that problem, but the way you're setting that up, okay, all right, yes. Okay, you're there. That's it. I'm going to be more open around mistakes. I'm going to find more of that funk. I might even teach mistakes to begin with and, like, talk about common errors. I might have my kids design their own tests so that they're creating multiple choices based off of likely mistakes. So now they're not just learning how to, like, learn test taking skills. They're learning how to think like a test maker. We're bringing them to the next level. We're bringing it to the next level with learning being the objective. Because if my kids can create their own multiple choice exams, I don't have to worry about whether or not they can get the right answer. Well, my kids can shift from asking what and how to asking why and what if. Now magic is happening.
So you have a really great way with teachers to be able to help them create the context within their classroom of learning and expanding. And I love your focus on critical thinking, because if we talked about like a superpower that we put into the hands of kids, yeah, I can teach you to do math. I can teach you to do reading. I can teach you to do a lot of different things. But if I can teach you to be a critical thinker and a strategic thinker, because strategy is not something that people do well, period. Like in business world, we have all these people come out of business schools not knowing strategy. They know a lot of other things, but strategy like seems to just escape people just at large. But what about the parents? So your first believer, this is the way I kind of see the belief gap situation. The first person who has to believe in you is your ruthless guardian, the guardian that God gave you as a child. Every child has an auntie or an aunt or a mom or a dad or a friend or somebody in their life who is like, oh no, not this one. You're not going to let this one fall into the depths of failure, right? And when that person is fairly ruthless and informed and knowledgeable and knows the kid, like, I know you're funny, you're smart, you're creative, and I'm not going to let anybody call you anything else. What do you have for them in terms of parents? Take some of this stuff I'm telling teachers in classrooms home and do it at home.
So part of our partnerships are comprehensive, because we do parent workshops around critical thinking, not to teach them to think critically, but to help them understand how what they already do is critical thinking, to help them really value their role in nurturing critical thinking at home. One of the biggest challenges that I see when it comes to parents, and it's a very common sort of mindset, is like, what did we learn about like being a parent? A lot of times we tell kids, and there's this common narrative, like, do good in school. Don't be getting in trouble in school. Do good, don't get in trouble. Mm-hmm. Do good, stay out of trouble. And as long as you're doing good and staying out of trouble, whatever have you. My whole thing is this. My whole thing is like, I see a report card with straight A's and some parents want to celebrate it. Me, I'm super suspicious. I'm like, all A's? So you just excel on everything. You're not getting no type of challenge in school at all. What is going on here? Why is it that good enough is good enough? Especially when I start digging in, like, look at the achievement scores on these state assessments, which is why it's so important. If you're getting straight A's, but you're not proficient in any of your subjects, according to what the state standards are saying, then what are you being evaluated on? How's this even making any sense? You don't actually know what you're doing. You don't know. Like, and when I was a math teacher, every single year, parents would protest to my principals and like, Mr. Seal is the worst. He's killing my kid. My kid always has straight A's in math. I'm like, listen to me. The kid does not know math. And I'm here though. I'm here and I'm on work in the morning and the afternoon after school. Like, we are gonna get there. But like, your kid has been rewarded for being good and not getting in trouble. But like, I'm not gonna give them 65% for participation. I'm not going to give them 25% for their notebook and how they take notes. I'm going to weigh the tests and quizzes accordingly because this is middle school and I'm trying to get them ready for high school and they need to actually know how to do math. It's not like some crazy idea that they should actually know the subject that I'm teaching. Mm-hmm. So, like, we've got to really be able to, like, be more skeptical, be more demanding of what actually matters, which is like, what's the evidence that they know? So I always try to tell parents, like, all right, if your school uses MAP or iReady, here's what it actually means when they get these reports home, right? Like, here's why it actually matters that your kid is reading at or above grade level. Like, you don't necessarily need to know how to be the person to make that all happen. But you know what? Like, if you don't see no growth, if you don't see anything, it's like, you need to ask questions.
So what's your talk style with your own kids? Knowing that like critical thinking is such a important feature of your thinking, like what you think in general, like how does that change the way that you engage them when you talk to them, when they ask you questions or when they, you're participating with them? How's it made you a different father?
So, I think the father I am is very predictable to anybody who's ever like seen me teach or seen me engage where, how do you spell education? The answer is always going to be, how do you spell dictionary? Because I'm not going to tell you how to spell anything when you can look that up yourself. Why is this? Why do you think that is? That's always going to be my thing. Where is this? Where might it be? Like, I'm not looking for it. Like, that's going to be on you. And even when I think about a lot of these different things that, like, we say productive struggle a lot in education, but a lot of times educators themselves who have children are out here figuring out every single thing for their own children. So I'm like, kids got to struggle at home too. They've got to grapple at home too. If like, I talk a lot about even like grocery shopping. before COVID and you had kids in the grocery, like, why can't they figure out like how much we can get on this and whether this is a good deal at Costco or not? Like kids have much more numeracy and number sense than we give them credit for if we decide to nurture that. If we decide to dig into that, So the other thing I would say is this when it comes to kids. I learned at a really young age when I was like acting a fool that there was difference between being smart and being a smart ass. And like when I started digging deeper around critical thinking, I realized critical thinking for the sake of critical thinking can't be enough. There's critical thinkers who engineered the Holocaust. There's critical thinkers who were masterminds behind like the Atlantic slave trade. Like at the end of the day, like it's got to be grounded in the sense that doing right is more important than being right. So this is one of the things that I just say all the time. Doing right is more important than being right. It's kind of this life lesson, and it humbles me sometimes when I'm like, you know what? You attempted to do right. Like the other day, oh my God, my daughter put like almost a half a roll of toilet paper in the bathroom and flushed it. It wasn't working. So she tried to plunge it, but she wasn't using the plunger. She was using the little brush thing. And I'm like, whew. And my wife wasn't having it, but I was like, you know what? Like she tried to fix a problem. She tried to fix it. She had no business trying to fix that problem in particular, but she tried. She failed miserably. But I'm like, in my mind, I'd rather have that. I'd rather have somebody be like, I messed it up. It's my responsibility, and I think I can fix it than mommy, daddy. Like,
yeah,
give it a shot. And
does your thinking and your teaching background and all that have you thinking a lot about the media that she watches, the things that you let her see, what you expose her to, all of that? Or are you more like a free range person? Let the kids kind of go out and just roam and figure stuff out?
So one of my favorite things to do is like, get her to like right now, you know what she's reading? She's reading A Right to Be Hostile, which is a collection of Boondocks comics from like the year 2006.
How old is she?
She is 8 years old.
Wow.
And the reason we're reading it is because like every time you see a reference you don't understand, that's going to be a conversation, something you look up. And she's like, like, why is Huey? Like, what is, like, I was like, oh, you don't know who Huey is? And and then there's little moments of like potential failure as a parent. She's like, Dad, who's Muhammad Ali? And I'm like, oh man. All right, but we can work on that. Work on that. So I just kind of go with the flow. She also likes reading Diary of the Wimpy Kid, like most 8-year-olds do. But the idea is that there's this sort of thing of like, I want to go where her energy is. If she's got questions, let's rock with that. Let's go with that flow. She wants to be on Ninja Warrior. Fine. She wants to design a ninja kit in that backyard. I'm not sure that's going to work, but great. So like, I'm just rolling with the flow based off of her interest and her energy and all of that. So,
I feel like I have and it's part of the reason I ask you this, like just as dad to dad, I have kind of a schizophrenic way of, that's a different way of raising my daughter than with my sons. I have one daughter and I have mostly sons. And I joke sometimes that I became a feminist and a sexist on the same day. Like on the day my daughter was born, I became both at the same time. And I became a feminist in the sense that I wanted to instill in my daughter that all of the perceptions that people will tell you you can't do because you're a girl, we're going to take care of that at home. We're going to fix that from day one. So you go into toy aisles, for instance, in any store, and when you're in the girl aisle because everything is pink and domestic, right? So all the boxes, all the everything on the shelf is pink. Which is a feminization of number one, your play life, and that what's coded into that are domestic toys, domestic things, or whatever. So as a father, I was like, we're going to break convention. We're going to we're not. You go down the boy aisle, everything is black, blue, and green, and it's all weaponized. It's all weapons, right? So I want a daughter who can break somebody's neck if she has to, right? So we're going to put you in kung fu, right? We're going to. we're going to have you. But you know what? Like God and life has a way of, well, my wife and I swore we weren't going to do the pink thing, for instance. And if you go in my daughter's room right now, it looks like a unicorn threw up all through the entire room. Like it's all sparkles and whatever and everything we weren't going to do. So somehow that stuff finds you anyways. But still the mental toughness to be able to say my daughter should be able to figure out problems. When I say the sexist part is I've actually instilled into her brothers, it is your job in life to make sure she never has a problem. I'm not going to be here forever. I'm going to die one day, and that may come sooner than you think. So I want to train into you, your multiple brothers, that, you know, she's never to have a problem, but I want to train in her. You don't need any assistance. You don't need any help. You're mentally tough. You can figure things out. But it's not easy, because that really got me thinking more about the belief gap with the boys. I didn't think as much about that until I had a girl, about how much the world is going to tell a girl what she can't do, and where she can't go. My mom tells the story a lot that she had a high school counselor who gave her all home ec classes and all kind of like domesticated classes. And my grandfather marched her back down to the school, into the counselor's office, and redid her entire schedule to have all rigorous things and whatnot. And she learned from that one instance, she learned my dad values X, even though the system values Y, I'm going for X, right? And that helped her do well in life.
So what you're talking about is something that's very interesting too, because it's like, to what extent, I mean, we live in Arizona, and we live in like a suburb of Phoenix where there's not a whole lot of diversity out here. And I think that like there's this point of like, our kids need to understand the systems that are here. They need to understand like what this reality is and the kinds of messaging that they're going to hear, because it becomes part of the armor. It becomes how you can deflect it. Like, she's in a Montessori preschool when this little girl was like, well, that's why nobody likes hanging out with brown people, right? Like, so it's like, this is Montessori preschool that you're hearing stuff like that. Of like, oh, I didn't invite you to my birthday party because we don't have brown people at our house.
Wow.
Like, Montessori preschool.
But she's already heard this?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But like, again, it's not going to be some massive surprise. They're going to understand the injustices that exist in our world, but they're also going to be like, well, like, that's kind of your loss. Like, you know, I'm a pretty fun person to have at parties, but I guess you missed out. But like, so it's not really any skin off of her back, but like, you know, so at some point, you know, we've got to do our job as parents to be vigilant around things like this as well. But I'm also not going to like paint these like fairy tales to my kids, like we're somehow past the nonsense and whatever have you. So I tell my kids this all the time, like, you know, your teachers, we've got like kind of like, you know, it's always going to be a little funky. Like, don't be surprised if daddy is never in love with any of your teachers, because I'm always going to be looking at them with a side eye. And if you see stuff that doesn't seem right, please come and talk to me about it, because I know things are crazy. She had a teacher one year who like, she's like complaining about the boys in the class, 3 black boys and one little Greek kid in like second grade. And she already has a pre-stat completed form of like referrals for these kids. You just send them out. It's like, you know what? Out. I'm like, what are you kicking out all these boys for? Like, and she has no shame. No shame. She's talking to me about it as if I'm going to be like, oh, okay, I understand. Yeah, good for you. Right?
No, but I'm just like, probably talking to you about it too, because for parents, there are parents who believe in compliant classrooms. So they like it when that other kid gets kicked out.
So, and this is the balance. This is the balance. And I've heard this debate be here before too, about like, you know, kids have a right to learn, right? And at a certain point, it's not really fair if like one kid is completely disrupting the rest of the class's right to learn. But typically that's not what's happening. You're going to kick a kid out because he walked by somebody's desk and when he brushed by, he accidentally knocked his pencil down. That's called being in second grade. I mean, I'm in my late 30s, and I would do that for a laugh or a giggle, right? He's not tripping anybody or hurting anybody or like, you know, shouting in the middle of class, curse words. He's just dropping somebody's pencil on the floor. right? And it's just like some kids don't have the privilege of being annoying. And that to me is really unjust. Like, why can't you just be annoying? A lot of second graders are actually really annoying.
Most second graders are annoying.
So like, but only certain kids are annoying enough to have like a permanent record on their disciplinary or go to juvie for what they did as annoying second graders. And this is where I just think like somehow we've lost it. Somehow it's like, I don't teach elementary school for a reason. But if you're teaching elementary school, why are you scared of a first grader?
I have always said, if I am going to teach any grade, and I've said this, like when I was a school board member, I used to visit schools. I always said that I would only teach kindergarten. That would be the only grade that I would teach. And I would love it every day. When I used to visit schools, there was nothing more fun than when I knew that I was visiting a kindergarten for the day. Because kids still believe in magic at that age. They still believe in a lot of things. Same thing with first and second grade or whatnot. But what I would notice is a progression. The more closer you got to third, fourth grade, there would be a change in students. They would start parting. They would have different things going on in their eyes. But kindergarten, man, like, listen, you know, if you could keep the spirit and the energy of kindergarten going for more grades than it is, where there's, you know, there's wonder and still believe in magic and you know, whatever, I would teach that grade. But they do get more annoying. Like middle school and high school probably would be the most annoying if I had to teach.
But for me, but that's the thing, right? Like everyone hates on middle school, whatever have you. For me, like that's where I kind of found my groove in life. That like I love the middle school brain. Like I love the advocacy. I love the like spontaneity. I love all those different aspects of like what middle school kids bring to the table. But like what I can't figure out is why can't we find a way to harness that? Like I mean, so you don't harness that. And then by the time in high school, we're complaining, oh, these kids are not engaged and they don't. But like, you had them. You had the chance to like go with that fire, enroll with that fire. But instead, you stomped out that fire. You poured cold water all over that fire. And now you're complaining that there's no heat.
And as a parent and as guards, and this is as we wrap, I would think that we have to be guardians of that fire. We have to actually know what it is, first of all, and see it, and then help educators throughout their years. An educator gets your kid fresh. They don't know your kid from a can of paint oftentimes, right? And you're the only person in between. You're the only person that's been with that kid for first grade and second and third or whatnot. And you can help their teachers understand early in the year. My kid's got anxiety. My kid's this, my kid's that. My kid loves poetry, blah, blah. I'm not telling you these things because I want to tell you how to teach. I'm just telling you these things as background knowledge so that if my kid reacts a certain way or whatever, but you'd be a great guardian in that way.
Part of that guardian thing too, especially as kids get older, I want to really just leave this for folks. You've got to be very intentional about who's the rest of the crew. We talk about this village all the time, but like actually lean on that village. Don't kind of have these things happening in private and secret, because that's how we are sometimes, right? We could be so ashamed and so embarrassed. Don't do that. Especially when you and your kid might not have the best relationship. Lean on uncles, coaches, music teachers, dance teachers, all the other people so that we can start getting this other thing going. So like really, really, really be intentional about building a crew around your kids so that it's not just you, it's not just that teacher, but there's so many other opportunities to really get that fire realized.
You always leave me with the point that is good for another show. So I hope that you come back, because this building the team is a provocative idea. Like what you just said actually is another show in itself, I think, in being intentional about building that team. Is a great nugget to rest on. For people listening and watching, I thank you all. You were great in the comments today. It was great to see you all again. I haven't done a show in a long time. Been a little bit tired of the discussions that I've participated in. I need more energy. Like, so Colin, you just gave me a lot of what I think actually is the path out of the morose that I have. Like the old discussion is old and tired of failure. Mm-hmm. What is it that we can do to think our way out of our current circumstance with our kids and help them be armed and prepared to be great thinkers, to be strong, to be critical, no matter what circumstance they're in, what classroom. Colin's book is Think Like a Lawyer. I have it up on the screen here so that you can take a look at it. Thinking Like a Lawyer, a framework for teaching critical thinking to all students. It's on Amazon and other bookmakers or other booksellers. Colin, what's your favorite bookseller, just so that we know? I always like to think about what we don't think about as consumers. How do you get paid the most? What's the best book platform?
So if you're an educator or an education leader, going to our website, thinklaw.us, and requesting a quote and getting bulk from us is the best way to do it. If you're just getting for individual, Amazon is probably the quickest and easiest way to get that done. But I also want to invite people. This Thursday, I'm having a conversation with Elena Aguilar. So if you go to our website, it's Educational Equity Equation Series. She has a whole series around coaching for equity, and she's very practical around the same kind of things we're talking about. Like, what are the nitty-gritty moves that it takes to make this equity work real in terms of translating to achievement? So, and just keep in touch. My Twitter handles there posted at Colin E. Seal. We'll love your feedback and to keep this work moving.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Colin. I appreciate you.
No problem. Thank you.